the thing that we really don't have the opportunity to make. It's finite. We have time, it's there, but I can't make any more. And so we think about time and we think how we manage time, and that doesn't change in the classroom.
It doesn't, and what's interesting is that my concept of time and the students' concept of time in the classroom could be completely different.
Oh, yeah.
The way they perceive the time that they're spending there and the way I perceive the time that I'm helping them spend there. And so what might seem to me as a very short period of time, for them might seem eternal, and what seems to me something to be eternal, for them could be very limited and almost constricted.
Well, and that's true in part because most of the work that we do at the university level is actually still with adolescents. We like to think of them as adults, but they're not. And adolescents have the unique ability to take a 10-minute task and make it last for 3 days. And they'll tell you they were busy. So how do we manage time in the classroom in ways that best facilitate learning, and not just us covering the material, because my job is not to cover material but help students uncover it. How do I best utilize time in the classroom in order to ensure that students are learning what they need to learn? And so that's kind of the topic of this conversation today.
Absolutely.
As we think about time and the use of timers in the classroom.
And I like the idea of use of timers because it's something that we were in K-12, it's something that's very intuitive for us to use. And when I worked in special education, for me, the timer was something that I used to indicate transition, time to move on, but it was more on from one place to another, not necessarily from one point in the conversation to the next or one point of instruction to the next. How was your experience with timers in the classroom?
And mine was a bit different because my work was predominantly with just the earlier stages of adolescence. I worked with early and mid-adolescence, and now I'm just happy to be working with late adolescence. And so the idea that timers were designed primarily for providing students with accountability for their productivity within a given time. So if I wanted them to accomplish this task, and I had estimated that that task would take a certain amount of time, then I said, I want you to take 7 minutes to, and then we'll give them the task to do. It's one of the reasons why I was so attached to my little kitchen timer, 97 cents, Walmart. Because one of the things that's very difficult to do with managing time in the classroom is to, with absolute certainty, know how a conversation will progress or how students will master certain things. You can project based on previous experience. But this kitchen timer for me allowed me to set the 7 minutes. They knew I said it. We practiced listening for that chime to go off. But let's say that I walked around the room and I realized that students were actually deeper in that conversation than I had anticipated, and that they were going places I had not thought they were going to go without me supporting a bit more. Well, I could back that timer up. They never knew it. I gave them more time to continue that discussion because goodness knows I didn't want to interrupt it. Or let's say that I realized that they didn't have some skills that I thought they did, and that it was moving along at a much faster pace because it was much more shallow than I wanted it. Then I could easily adjust that timer, speed it up, and the timer actually went off earlier than the 7 minutes, but I could manage that. So it was one of my favorite uses of a timer and how to do time, because I wanted the students to be able to learn to be accountable for the time in class. This is the product that you need to produce. This is the conversation in which you need to engage. Now, here's a time frame for doing it, because again, otherwise, they can make a 2-minute conversation last days if you will let them, and don't really see that they didn't do what you asked them to do. And so time makes them more accountable.
It does make it more accountable, and what I have found is that I have taken that concept of time that I applied with my students, and I've applied it more to how I view time for them. So oftentimes I say in my class, you have a Sandoval minute. A Sandoval minute could be anywhere from 60 seconds to 90 seconds to 30 seconds, because there's a certain nervousness that I sometimes experience when I ask them to engage in a conversation or to meet in groups and guiding that conversation. And so if I don't keep myself accountable to a time, I might give them less time or more time than is required. And so what I find is that time is so abstract. It's something that we cannot really see. So a timer like yours or like mine, which is what I use as a time timer, is it really makes time a concrete thing, something that they can see, something that in some cases they can hear.
Right.
And so it really helps them navigate
Right.
to where they are not focused on the time, but they can actually engage in that deep discussion, that deep work, and not be hyper aware of the clock is ticking, because they know that at some point there's going to be a stopping point and it'll be time to move on.
Right.
So the timer, where yours goes forward, mine goes this way. So I like using this timer, not quite Walmart, not quite 97 cents. Teacher store, so you know it's
more expensive.
More
right?
expensive. But the way this timer works, the timer, is time actually moves this way. So it helps the students see time as in the sense of how much time they have left. And so I've
Which
used
is a
this.
great skill. Yeah.
It's a great skill, and I found it to be to have two different responses from students. Some students do focus too much on this and they begin to accelerate as they get closer. Other students find some rest and saying, okay, I have enough time.
I still have time left, right?
But what I like to use it is when I do have, for example, presentations, and you say you have a 10-minute presentation, but you have that one student who's going to, prepare for 30 minutes and talk for 70. So really this right here says, you know what, in the professional world, you're given a certain amount of time and you have to stick to that time. So we
Right.
need to operate within the time frame that you're given, because your time as well as everybody else's time is important.
Sure. Another timer that I've started using that I think is really helpful are ones that you can just go on to any search engine and type in 3-minute timer, and you can get countdown timers, you can get timers that count up. They've got all kinds of flashy backgrounds and all that kind of stuff if that's what you want. I will always worry about distractibility in relation to those fancy ones, but they can be if you want a high energy, if the conversation or the activity is really high energy and fun, then that may be very appropriate. So there are lots of different ways to utilize timers in a classroom to help students and teachers navigate time in a much more productive way, because what we want to do is maximize the opportunity for learning. One of the things that I found is really important in thinking about just the reason for wanting to think about time is that one of the things that we know about the brain is that the brain has a limited window for intense focus. And we would love to think that that is 50 minutes or 90 minutes, since that's the length of our classes, but we know...
And it's all based on our, ability to focus.
Exactly, but we know that that's not true. As a matter of fact, even for adults, they say those with a highly developed sense of focus actually probably can only intensely focus for about 15 to 18 minutes. So, with that in mind, I want to make sure I utilize time in the classroom in these chunks of time that maximize focus. So when I think about developing my plan for the day, how I'm going to communicate and engage students in the learning for whatever the focus is of that day, I want to think in 7 to 12 minute chunks, because I don't want to max the brain out every single time. It's almost like in technology terms, when your internet is not quite as fast as you want it to be, and the movie has to buffer a little bit. It's almost like the brain plays that part, and then it kind of needs an opportunity to buffer. So how can I utilize this 7 to 12 minutes with maximum, and then give the brain just that little bit of time to buffer, and then it can refocus again? If I try to focus for 45 minutes, that's not going to happen. So what I've found just mostly through experience with students is that there are those students that look to have very long attention spans. There are adults who appear to have very long attention spans. What they really have is the capacity to buffer quickly and refocus. Others have less adept or practiced skills at that refocusing. And so what I want to do in my lesson plan is provide the refocus. I want to,
Built-in
yes,
focus.
exactly, built into the design. So I give that opportunity and don't have to rely on them already having that skill. Now by building that in, I'm practicing the brain refocusing quickly, which is going to develop that ability. And I really want that for my students as they move on away from me. I want them to be good managers of their time. But it's the ability to refocus really quickly. So in lesson planning, it helps us move the focus forward in a very strategic way. So let's say that I've been presenting some fundamental information, and I've been talking for about 8 minutes, 9 minutes. Then I'm probably at that point want to pause and do something. It doesn't have to be another 7-minute thing. Just remember, a quick buffer. So I may say, turn to someone next to you and summarize what we've just discussed. Or turn to the person next to you, if they're already set up in groups, at your group, quickly discuss, 30 seconds, what's a question each one of you still has about the information that's been presented. So the brain has a chance to chunk that and buffer and get ready for the next one. So it's not that I have to think 7 to 12 minutes, 7 to 12 minutes, 7 to 12, but it's a 7 to 12 minutes buffer reboot, 7 to 12 minutes buffer reboot kind of thing. And that allows then for me to maximize their focus, which in the end is the best use of my classroom time, because I'm not reteaching things just because they lost focus. And I think that that's a really important element in that. So timers help us to further the instruction by maximizing focus, by doing it in these chunks of information. Now, one of the things that I find a challenge is I don't ever think that my classes have enough time. Instead of a 2-hour course, this really needs to be a phase 1 and a phase 2, and each of them need to be 3-hour courses over 2 semesters. Oh, exactly, right. And so it's one of those that in order to really maximize that, it's so important that I do that in really strategic ways. But one of my problems is I then try to do it too fast, and the brain can only take in information. So I have even just told students, guys, you all don't worry about the timer. I'm setting a timer, but it's for me.
Exactly.
I'm moving me on, because I don't want to spend too long on this, because if that's the case, I'm going to shortchange something else, and I need to set a timer for me. So it may even be that the timer ends up, at least initially, until you kind of get the rhythm of that, it's more the timer's for me and to keep me on task as the instructor, as opposed to always being about the students.
And something that I have found myself doing, because this semester in particular, I went from a class that I teach 3 times a week to twice a week, so the time is longer, so I've had to readjust how much time I spend on everything. And so I've set like different alarms with a buzzer on my phone, and so I have to gauge now, okay, how much is my prayer and devotion going to take? How much time am I going to spend revisiting prior learning to activate, or activate prior knowledge, how much time I'm going to spend on the introduction, how much time I'm going to allot for the assessment. So I think the key in what you mentioned was, when you write into your lessons, is that intentionality.
Right.
Really plan out your time with intentionality and allow yourself, as we would with the students, to use a timer for yourself. We often think that we've arrived at this place where we don't need those resources, but sometimes, like myself, I need those resources, and the key is, to use it often and to use it consistently creates that behavior. So if you're going to consider using timers, consider giving it a time frame to see how does it work for your class, does it work for what you're trying to do, and then you will find that you, as well as the students, get into the habit of using them, and also allow the timer to do its job, and for you to do your job while the timer is running.
Right. And I do think that is an important element. Sometimes, and this is true of many teaching practices, is when students don't accomplish it perfectly the first time we use it, we think that doesn't work.
Absolutely.
So if I'm trying to teach students to maximize their intentionality and their focus by using time and timers particularly, then I need to do it with the idea that the first time I'm probably not going to utilize it highly effectively, and the students may not as well. But that gives me an opportunity to say what did work about it, and what is it that I need to do in the implementation next time that would be a little bit different, that would move that forward. And that's no different with other teaching practices in the same way that it is with timers. As we kind of finish this up, I think back to, for years, and this was in my adult life, my mother would ask me every year, well, honey, what do you want for Christmas? And I would say a 36-hour day. And she would say it wouldn't make any difference, you would just fill that up too. And so time is a finite thing. We come back to that. We can't make a 36-hour day as much as some of us might like to. All we can do is learn to make the most of the time that we have, both instructionally and philosophically, I suspect, but make the most of it so that we maximize student learning within that time frame.
Absolutely, and hopefully you found this to be helpful, and if you want to give this timer a shot, just let me know, and I would be more than glad to send it your way. And and if we need to let you know where you can find a 97-cent timer,
I'll even
we
let
can
you
do that
borrow
too.
it, yes.